Okay, welcome to the deep dive. This is where you send us sources you're curious about, and we extract the essential knowledge. Fast, thorough, and always tailored for you.
And today we're really zeroing in on a pretty potent moment. It's a 45-second speech by Jasmine Crockett, who's definitely a rising political figure.
Right. And the sources we've got are excerpts describing this pivotal event and, the impact it had afterwards. Huge impact.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to get into the skin of those 45 seconds. What made it so powerful? What truth was she getting at?
And why did it just resonate so deeply across the country? We want to understand not just what she said, but why it mattered so much.
Exactly. Why it landed the way it did.
Right. Okay, so let's set the scene. Imagine those bright TV lights, that kind of intense backstage energy. Jasmine's in the green room, and the picture we get is one of real focus.
Yeah, deliberate breathing, almost meditative, the sources say.
And then on the other side, you've got her opponent, Karoline Leavitt, described as confident, polished.
Kind of embodying what people often call the right-wing political machine. And just for clarity, that term usually points to, a well-organized, well-funded conservative political structure.
And there's this detail about Caroline wanting to hit the race question early, armed with stats. It sort of suggests a very data-driven, maybe slightly detached approach.
It definitely sets up a contrast. The established politician versus someone maybe coming from a different angle entirely.
And what's really interesting is how Jasmine prepared. No teleprompter.
Right, just memory and resolve. That alone tells you something, doesn't it? It signals a deep personal connection to the message.
Totally. And we learned she spent the night before reading these handwritten letters, just personal accounts from people feeling, unheard by the justice system.
And one sentence from those letters apparently became her sort of compass. I don't need you to win for us. I just need you to say what they won't let us say.
Wow. That really speaks to a sense of responsibility, doesn't it? Voicing things for others.
Absolutely. And that carries through to how she walks onto the stage, described as calm but coiled.
Yeah, not there to argue or perform, but to remember, remind, and represent.
Even that little exchange they have.
Yep.
Caroline says something like, hope you brought your A game.
Almost dismissive, yeah. And Jasmine just replies, just enough.
Simple, grounded, like I've got what I need. No bluster.
That contrast in how they carry themselves, it's a key insight, I think. Caroline's outward confidence, maybe leaning on rehearsed points.
Compared to Jasmine's inner focus, carrying the weight of those stories, it really sets the stage for a moment where, authenticity could really cut through.
So then we get to the big question. The moderator asks point blank, is systemic racism in America a myth or a reality?
And there's no dramatic lead up, just silence, stark silence.
Caroline jumps in first, as expected. And her take, she basically dismisses systemic racism as, well, outdated.
Right, she cites examples, black president, black billionaires.
Yeah.
Argues everyone has the same shot now.
It's a familiar perspective, often called the colorblind argument, right? Suggesting race isn't a major factor anymore because the explicit laws are gone, focusing more on individual effort.
Exactly. She's using what you might call representative anecdotes, those individual success stories, as evidence against broader systemic problems. It's a common rhetorical tactic, but it can sometimes obscure the bigger picture.
And while Caroline's giving her answer, Jasmine is just still. The description really emphasizes her silence. Folded hands, unreadable expression.
They even say her posture alone spoke volumes. That deliberate stillness, it's powerful nonverbal communication, especially against her opponent's confidence.
Yeah, sometimes what you don't say.
Precisely. In a debate setting that usually rewards quick, forceful answers, her silence creates this vacuum. It makes the audience, maybe even Caroline, think about the complexities Caroline's sound bites are kind of glossing over, suggests deeper thought.
And then she speaks. Her voice is described as so even it almost startled.
And what she says is simple but devastating. The system works, just not for all of us.
Oof. Yeah. And apparently the reactions in the room were subtle. But there. A chair creak. Someone catching their breath. Like that quiet truth just landed with real weight.
It's such a concise, potent sentence. It acknowledges, yeah, the system does work for some, but immediately points out the fundamental unfairness in how it's applied. It's stated like a fact, almost no emotion, which weirdly makes it even stronger.
And she keeps going. She acknowledges the reports, the progress people often mention. But then she pivots right back to those letters, those lived realities.
Right? This isn't abstract theory or policy memo she's talking about. It's human experience.
And then that incredible line, emotion doesn't erase the facts. It adds the why.
That's such a critical point.
Yeah.
Often, personal stories, emotion, they get dismissed in politics as subjective, irrational even.
Yeah, too emotional.
Exactly. But Jasmine just brilliantly reframes it. She argues that emotion gives the crucial context, the understanding of why the facts and stats are what they are. It connects the data to the human cost.
So then we see this shift. She goes from that broad statement to really specific personal stories from her time as a public defender.
Yeah. Started with Darius, a 17-year-old black kid wrongly convicted of robbery.
And the evidence was just so flimsy. He looked like the kid. Those kids all wear hoodies. It's chilling.
Just assumptions, stereotypes leading to this huge injustice.
And the details are disturbing. No real investigation into his alibi, hints of racial profiling. The jury apparently just silent on key questions.
It paints a really stark picture of a system where justice maybe isn't so blind, where prejudice can creep in, and Darius's quiet resignation when found guilty. It says so much about his own experience.
And that moment with his mother afterwards, just heartbreaking. Saying, you know, I told him not to run, I told him to stay quiet, I told him to be respectful, and it still wasn't enough.
Ugh. That captures that feeling of powerlessness, right? That even playing by the rules doesn't guarantee fairness.
And that's the moment Jasmine says she stopped believing in fairness as just an assumption, when she learned the law could look clean on paper but be stained in practice.
That anecdote is such a powerful turning point. For her and for us listening, it takes it beyond abstract debate about systemic racism and grounds it in this tangible human tragedy, a clear example of how the system can fail someone.
Then we get these brief mentions of other cases. Javon, 10 years old, suspended for drawing a water gun while his actual trauma gets ignored.
And Malik, 15, tackled and hurt just for running from police out of fear.
They're quick examples, but they reinforce that this isn't just about Darius. It suggests a pattern.
Yeah, a pattern of assumptions, maybe implicit bias, disproportionate responses affecting young people of color in different ways.
And then there's that story, the mother who just says he's already lost during a minor stop and frisk case. That feeling of inevitability.
It's devastating. It speaks to such a deep lack of trust in the system, a feeling that the outcome's already decided.
So, bringing it to the present, Jasmine then shares the story of Tiana. 14 years old, stopped and searched walking home, even though she didn't match the description.
And the focus there is the emotional impact, right? She felt like she did something wrong, even though she did everything right.
Exactly. And it led her to change her behavior out of fear, feeling like she needed to be small enough to disappear. It's about that psychological toll.
Tiana's story really shows how these encounters, even without legal consequences, can just erode a young person's sense of safety, their self-worth, how systemic issues play out in individual lives and change how people act.
And Karoline's response to these really personal, painful stories.
She dismisses them, calls them emotion, powerful maybe, but anecdotal, not policy.
It's a common way to devalue individual experiences, isn't it? Pushing them aside in favor of supposedly objective data, avoiding the uncomfortable truth.
Yeah, it reflects that tendency to prioritize numbers over stories. Stats show trends, sure, but the narratives give context. They humanize it. Calling them anecdotal can be a way to dodge the reality of that emotional impact.
But Jasmine pushes right back. Anecdotes like this are the only reason policies ever get written, she says.
And adds, policy without emotion, that's how we get laws that forget the people they govern.
Boom. It's a direct challenge to the idea that policy should be cold, detached from human experience.
She's underlining the vital role of these personal stories in actually understanding societal problems and making effective policy, connecting the individual experience to the bigger picture.
Which leads to this section described as the reckoning. Karoline pivots, starts talking about responsibility, accuses the system of celebrating victimhood.
Right, claiming that mindset is more dangerous than any law. It feels like a clear deflection.
Trying to shift the blame away from the system and onto how individuals think.
Exactly. It's a common rhetorical move, blame the culture of victimhood, to avoid talking about systemic inequality.
But Jasmine's reaction is apparently key. Unreadable, calm, deliberate.
And then she drops that line, "You've never had to tell your child not to die when a cop pulls them over."
Wow. just devastatingly direct. It immediately highlights the completely different realities, the different fears people live with based on race.
It just exposes that huge gap in lived experience between those who can generally trust the police and those who live with this constant fear. The whole idea of having to rehearse how to act during a traffic stop, it just underlines the anxiety.
And then she brings out the names. Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, briefly mentioning their deaths during police encounters.
And she says, to you, they're incidents, maybe mistakes, maybe tragedies, but to us, they're instructions.
That word, instructions, so powerful. It reframes these deaths not as isolated events, but as lessons. Lessons in how to survive a potentially lethal reality.
Naming them personalizes it, forces everyone to confront the human cost. And instructions really drives home how these tragedies become cautionary tales, shaping how whole communities have to navigate the world.
And she gets right to that unspoken truth. The privilege of being able to trust the badge, to expect help, a privilege many just don't have.
Yeah, it underscores that fundamental difference in experience. Acknowledging that disparity in trust is just crucial to understanding the impact of systemic inequality.
So when Karoline tries to pivot again, this time to black-on-black crime, personal responsibility, education, two-parent homes.
It feels like a classic deflection tactic, right?
Yeah.
Change the subject, fall back on these familiar, often racially charged tropes that avoid the systemic issues entirely. It ignores the underlying factors, often rooted in historical inequality, that contribute to violence in marginalized communities.
But Jasmine apparently just calmly takes control back. We're not asking for pity, she says. We're demanding parity.
Parity, equality, equal status, equal opportunity. It perfectly captures her argument.
Yeah, it reframes the whole thing. Not asking for sympathy, but demanding fairness, demanding justice within the system itself.
Likely.
And then she starts breaking down these systemic inequities, where actually counts them off on her fingers.
Yeah, like what?
Well, things like housing discrimination,
Okay.
higher maternal mortality rates for Black women, school funding issues tied to property taxes.
Right, the classic link.
Exactly. And she even brings up proximity-based violence in like segregated and disinvested areas. It's this concise, powerful list of systemic failures.
By listing those specific areas, housing, health, education, safety, she moves past generalizations. She gives concrete examples of how the system actively disadvantages certain communities. Linking things like school funding to ongoing racial disparities really illustrates that systemic impact.
And she wraps it up with that incredibly powerful statement: we are not broken, we are blocked.
Blocked by systems that weren't built for us, then blamed for not breaking through.
It just completely dismantles that whole personal responsibility argument when the playing field itself is so uneven.
It perfectly captures her core point. The focus has to shift from blaming individuals to looking at the real, significant systemic barriers that hold people back. It challenges that narrative that marginalized communities are somehow flawed, pointing instead to the external forces blocking them.
The aftermath described sounds intense. The studio atmosphere shifts. Karoline looks uneasy. The host pauses. The audience is just still taking it all in.
And Jasmine's final words: we're not burning the system down. We're trying to stop it from burning us alive.
And then it wasn't a line. It was a verdict. Simple, inarguable. Just feels like a mic drop moment.
That final statement is so clear, so powerful. It reframes the fight for justice not as destruction, but as survival against a harmful system. Calling it a verdict gives it this weight, this certainty.
And the immediate reaction was telling. Social media, yeah, divided as always, but the wider impact was huge and mostly positive.
Definitely. It trended online, cable news replayed it constantly, late-night shows talked about it, even the usually staid Sunday morning shows covered it.
Viral hashtags popped up, and the feeling seemed to be that she spoke for us all, showed how you speak truth to power.
Yeah, and even people who disagreed seemed to struggle to counter the sheer impact of how she said it, the truth it carried. It just resonated beyond the usual political lines.
We hear about the ripple effects, too, taught in classrooms, used in sermons, played at city council meetings.
Even inspiring a mural. And that story about the police chief in Mississippi using her, quote, to spark reflection in his own department, committing to change, that's significant.
And the retired Marine saying, that's what courage sounds like. A debate coach using the clip for a new prompt. These are real-world indicators of its power.
These examples show just how far her words traveled beyond politics into education, community talks, personal reflection. It highlights how one powerful message can really spark broader conversations and maybe even action.
And the deep dive ends with this quiet scene. Jasmine back home, kitchen table, watching the clip.
Surrounded by personal things, reminders of her past, her motivations like the "our time is now" sign.
There's this sense of calm acceptance of the impact, and that quiet but firm, we're done waiting.
And then that whisper, "for them, always, for them." It brings it all back to those letters, those courtroom memories, the people whose unheard truths fueled those 45 seconds.
It really humanizes her and reinforces that deep personal connection, that commitment driving her.
Absolutely. It underscores that it came from a place of real responsibility to amplify those voices.
So wrapping this up, Jasmine Crockett's 45 seconds, way more than just a viral blip. It was this really potent, deeply felt articulation of lived experience.
Yeah, it directly challenged the standard narratives about systemic racism, about responsibility. And the impact came not just from what she said, but how she said it.
That calm, fact-based delivery mixed with those undeniable personal stories.
It's a powerful illustration of how individual voices, grounded in truth and experience, can ignite these crucial, broader conversations and challenge narratives that have been around for a long time. Her speech is just a prime example of using personal stories to light up systemic issues and demand real accountability.
And for you listening in who joined us for this deep dive wanting that quick, thorough understanding, we really hope you got some of those aha moments, seeing how a short speech can unpack so much truth and spark real change.
Yeah. So here's a final thought maybe for you to chew on. Think about that power, the enduring power of individual voices to start wider conversations, to challenge things people just accept.
Consider the role personal stories play in driving change in systems, and maybe ask yourself, in your own life, your own sphere, how could you use your voice to speak truth to power, even if it's just for 45 seconds?